"Leave before you embarrass me," Blair Whitmore hissed loud enough for the whole ballroom to hear. Everett Hale said nothing. He set down the papers that could have saved her company from a $480 million collapse and walked out the door. No one in that room knew who he really was, or that the woman throwing him out had just handed her own downfall to the one man who could have stopped it. Minutes later, the client closed the contract, canceled the signing, and asked one devastating question: why had she just thrown out the only Beverly? 6 weeks before that question was ever asked. Whitmore Dynamics had been preparing for the largest signing in its history. A $480 million partnership with Langford Global that would carry the company's payment platform into more than 30 countries. The deal was meant to erase a mountain of debt coming due within the year and to cement Blair's reputation among a board of directors who had grown impatient with her leadership. The ceremony was staged inside a glittering hotel ballroom in downtown Chicago, where executives arrived in tailored suits, photographers lined the entrance, and the city's most influential investors filled every seat. Everett arrived in an old suit that had been altered more than once to still fit properly, and no one on the leadership team had invited him as an honored guest. Patricia Langford herself had insisted that the man who built the company's risk models be present to answer questions before any signature touched the page, though almost nobody in the Whitmore leadership wanted to admit that man was Everett. In the documents prepared for the client, Nolan Pierce had quietly removed Everett's name from the analysis and replaced it with the title of a senior management team that had done none of the actual work. Whitmore Dynamics needed this partnership more desperately than most of the people in that ballroom realized, since a wave of maturing debt was set to come due within the year, and the board had made it clear to Blair in private and repeated conversations that her position depended on delivering this exact signature. She had spent the better part of a decade climbing toward this evening, building a public image of poise and certainty that investors trusted almost instinctively, and she had convinced herself that image was the very thing keeping the company afloat. Nothing about that carefully constructed evening had left room in her mind for a quiet man in an outdated jacket to complicate the performance she had rehearsed for weeks. Blair spotted Everett standing near the signing table and felt an immediate wave of irritation, certain that a low-level analyst in an outdated suit would undercut the polished image she had spent months constructing for this exact evening. Marissa Cole, the company's head of communications, quietly reminded her that Patricia had specifically requested Everett's presence, but Blair waved the warning away, trusting that Nolan and the legal team could handle any technical question that arose. Everett ignored the dismissive glances directed his way and instead reviewed the final version of the contract on a small tablet, the way he had reviewed thousands of pages before. In a career nobody at Whitmore Dynamics knew he'd once had. What he found stopped him cold. The liability appendix had been altered only hours before the ceremony began. Under the new language, Whitmore Dynamics would absorb every loss from a system failure in any market where the platform operated, even losses caused entirely by a foreign partner's own negligence. The exposure was no longer measured in the hundreds of thousands of dollars they had budgeted for. It now had no ceiling at all, a number large enough to bankrupt the entire company if the wrong country had a bad month. Everett moved to find Blair immediately, but Nolan intercepted him first, insisting the change was routine legal housekeeping and ordering him back to his assigned position near the refreshment tables. Everett did not believe him for a second. He printed a side-by-side comparison of the two versions of the appendix, intending to place it directly into Blair's hands before the signing ceremony could begin, because whatever politics existed inside this company, they mattered less to him than the hundreds of employees whose jobs depended on this deal surviving contact with reality. As the MC called Blair and Patricia toward the small stage set up beside the signing table, Everett scrolled one more time through the edit history embedded in the document and saw unmistakably the digital signature of Nolan Pierce attached to the exact moment the appendix had changed. Everett crossed the room quickly, while Blair was still exchanging pleasantries with a cluster of investors, and he leaned close enough to speak without drawing attention, telling her the contract had been altered and that the company could not sign until the appendix was verified. Blair never looked down at the papers in his hand. She looked instead at his worn jacket and then past his shoulder at the photographers capturing every movement near the stage, calculating in an instant how this exchange would appear in tomorrow's coverage. Nolan stepped in, immediately declaring that Everett was overreacting, because he simply did not understand the legal architecture behind an international transaction of this size. Everett tried again, explaining as plainly as he could that the new clause could create an obligation running into the hundreds of millions of dollars, and he pressed the printed comparison into Blair's hands so she would have no excuse not to see it. Warren Beckett, the chairman of the board, stood close enough to make it clear with his posture alone that the ceremony could not be delayed for any reason, and Blair felt cornered in front of the very people whose approval she needed most. She handed the papers back without reading a single line, stepped close to Everett, and said the words that would define the rest of the evening: "Leave before you embarrass me." She had spoken quietly, but not quietly enough, and the sentence carried far enough that several nearby executives lowered their eyes in second-hand discomfort, while Nolan allowed himself a small satisfaction. Everett asked her calmly, and without any edge in his voice, whether she was certain this was what she wanted, because it would be the last chance she had to reconsider before the signing began. Blair told him he had no further role at the ceremony and instructed security to escort him out if he refused to leave on his own. Everett did not argue the point further. He set the comparison document on the table, unclipped his employee badge, and walked toward the exit, while the room pretended not to watch him go. Patricia Langford had watched the entire exchange unfold from a few feet away, and she asked Blair directly why the man responsible for the final risk verification had just left the building before his work was finished. Blair answered that Everett was only a low-level analyst, trying to draw attention to himself, a claim that even she did not fully believe as she said it. Russell Dean Langford, Global's chief counsel, opened the contract folder and asked almost casually who would now confirm the risk model in Everett's absence, and Nolan assured the room that the executive team had already completed every necessary check. Russell then asked 3 precise technical questions about the compensation mechanism, the liquidity buffer, and the data recovery rights buried in the new appendix, and Nolan could not answer a single one of them convincingly. Patricia closed her pen, folded the contract shut, and announced without raising her voice that Langford Global would not be signing that evening. Blair, stunned, demanded an explanation, and Patricia looked toward the door, through which Everett had just disappeared, and said that her company had only continued pursuing this partnership because they trusted the one man Blair had just thrown away. Within 10 minutes, every trace of the $480 million agreement had been pulled from the shared signing platform, and Blair's phone lit up moments later with a warning from the bank if the contract was not restored within 72 hours. Whitmore Dynamics would lose its entire credit line. Blair left the hotel in chaos as the company's stock began sliding the instant word of the canceled ceremony reached the financial press. Warren called an emergency session before midnight, blaming Blair publicly for failing to control her own staff and demanding she bring Everett back before the markets opened the next morning. She assumed at first that money or a title would be enough to lure him back, and she called his number twice that night without receiving an answer. Everett had already returned to his quiet apartment on the edge of the city, where he set his badge on the kitchen counter, loosened his tie, and opened a small box of old files he hadn't touched in years. Papers from a career almost nobody at Whitmore Dynamics knew he'd left behind. Those files told a story the company had never bothered to ask about. Years earlier, Everett had been a senior strategist at Harland Advisory, a firm that built the kind of risk architecture large corporations relied on to survive hostile mergers and cross-border disasters, and he had personally designed the compensation framework Langford Global still used to this day. After his wife died, he stepped away from a career built on constant travel and relentless pressure so he could give his full attention to raising his daughter, who had since grown into an independent adult, living in another state and building a life of her own, far from the events now unfolding in Chicago. Everett had chosen a quieter, steadier job afterward, not because his talent had faded, but because he no longer wanted status to define the shape of his life. He simply hadn't expected that quiet choice to make him invisible to the people who depended on his work every single day. Sitting alone with that old box of files, Everett thought briefly of his daughter, now grown and settled far from Chicago, building a career and a life entirely her own, and he remembered how certain he had once been that stepping back from ambition would let him give her something steadier than the constant travel and pressure of his old career ever could. He had never once regretted that choice. Even now, even after watching a room full of strangers treat him as though 2 decades of expertise had simply never existed. What stung, he admitted quietly to himself that night, was not the loss of status he had already given up willingly, but the discovery that an entire company had spent 2 years accepting his work while erasing every trace of the man who produced it. Marissa arrived at his apartment that same night to deliver an apology on Blair's behalf, and Everett let her in but made clear immediately that a hastily arranged invitation could not undo 2 years of being treated as disposable. Marissa admitted with visible discomfort that Everett's name had been stripped from report after report, something she had once dismissed as ordinary office politics, but now suspected was a deliberate effort by Nolan to bury his contribution entirely. Everett showed her the printed comparison from earlier that night, walking her through exactly how the new appendix had been engineered, not as a careless mistake, but as a mechanism designed to saddle Whitmore with catastrophic losses. Shortly after the platform launched, if the company collapsed under that weight, he explained, a private investment fund would be perfectly positioned to buy its remaining assets for a fraction of their worth. Marissa asked whether he would come back and present his findings to the board directly, and Everett declined, telling her plainly that Blair had not made a simple mistake born of confusion. She had been warned clearly, and had chosen her own image over the truth anyway. While Everett spoke with Marissa, Blair arrived at his empty desk inside the Whitmore offices, and found it almost completely bare save for a single notebook filled with formulas, edit histories, and warnings that had been repeatedly ignored by the people meant to act on them. It was the first moment she began to understand that Everett had been trying to warn the company for months, quietly and persistently, long before that night at the ballroom. She opened the last email he had sent before the signing ceremony and saw the subject line staring back at her evidence of internal contract manipulation. For the first time since the ceremony ended, Blair felt something closer to shame than panic. Blair spent the following morning digging through Everett's personnel file, and she noticed almost immediately that it had been unusually condensed when he first joined the company, stripped down to a handful of vague lines describing him only as a contract consultant. An older archived record told a very different story, one that listed him as a former director of strategy at Harland Advisory, a title that appeared nowhere in the versions circulating internally. When she searched the deals Harland Advisory had handled during Everett's tenure there, she found that he had helped rescue 3 major corporations from the brink of bankruptcy, though his name rarely surfaced publicly because of the strict confidentiality agreements common to that kind of dogright work. Russell Dean called her directly that afternoon and confirmed without hesitation that Everett was the very architect behind the protective framework Langford Global still relied on after a major merger 8 years earlier. Patricia, he added, did not trust Whitmore Dynamics as an institution at all. She trusted the model Everett had personally verified, and nothing more. Blair asked Russell why a man with that history would accept a low-level analyst position at her company, and his answer landed harder than she expected. He told her that walking away from status was not the same thing as losing talent. And he suggested she ask herself a more uncomfortable question: why had her own company only managed to use Everett's genius after erasing every trace of Dumonsode, who deserved credit for it? She replayed the footage from the ceremony afterward, watching her own face as she delivered that sentence to him, and studied his response frame by frame. There had been no anger in his expression at all, only a quiet, complete disappointment that unsettled her far more than outrage would have. For the first time in the entire crisis, Blair felt genuinely ashamed of herself rather than merely afraid of losing the contract. She went to see him in person that evening, opening with an offer to triple his salary and promote him to vice president of strategy before he could even finish hearing the proposal. Everett cut her off before she reached the end of the sentence, telling her the issue had never been about money or a title in the first place. When Blair pleaded that hundreds of employees could lose their jobs if the company failed, Everett pointed out that she was using those same employees as a convenient excuse, despite having done nothing over the past 2 years to protect them from a toxic culture of credit stealing and quiet dismissal. Hier ver, v. He asked her whether she even knew the name of the person who cleaned her own office each night, and Blair had no answer to give him. He told her plainly that the contract had not vanished because he walked out of the room, It vanished because Langford Global had watched a chief executive fail to see the value standing directly in front of her. Blair absorbed the criticism without defending herself, and before she left, she asked what it would take for him to even consider returning. Everett laid out 3 conditions with the same clarity he brought to every contract he had ever reviewed. An independent investigation into who altered the appendix, and why a public correction restoring credit to every employee whose work Nolan had quietly claimed as his own, and a public acknowledgement from Blair herself that placed the responsibility for that night squarely on her shoulders rather than on any subordinate. Blair agreed to all 3 without negotiating a single term, a decision that surprised even her. When she returned to the office the next morning, Nolan informed her that the board had already scheduled a vote to remove her from her position by the following day. Blair immediately gathered Marissa, along with an outside legal team, and ordered Nolan's access to the contract systems suspended without delay. Nolan responded by accusing Blair of panicking in a way that endangered the entire company, and Warren sided with him, openly demanding she halt her investigation until after the board's vote took place. Marissa, working quietly through backup servers late into the night, uncovered an encrypted chain of messages between Nolan and a representative from Redmont Capital, an investment fund that had repeatedly tried to acquire Whitmore Dynamics, only to be turned away by Blair on every occasion. The plan Marissa reconstructed had 3 distinct stages: alter the appendix, so the Langford contract became a financial liability rather than an asset; ensure Whitmore still signed it by removing Everett from the verification process entirely; and then trigger a controlled failure in a foreign market that would leave the company unable to meet its obligations, forcing a distressed sale to Redmont at a price far below its real value. Nolan stood to receive a senior executive role and a payout worth tens of millions of dollars once the acquisition closed. Redmont Capital had approached Whitmore Dynamics no fewer than 4 times over the previous 2 years. Each offer dressed up as a friendly strategic partnership rather than the hostile acquisition it actually was. And each time Blair had rejected the overtures without ever suspecting that someone, inside her own leadership team, was quietly negotiating a different outcome behind her back. Nolan had grown convinced, after years of watching Blair take credit for decisions built largely on other people's analysis, that he deserved a payout far greater than any salary the company could offer him honestly. Warren, for his part, had told himself that selling the company was simply sound business, a rational exit before market conditions worsened, and he had stopped asking hard questions about the human cost of that plan a long time ago. None of them had accounted for the possibility that the very employee they dismissed as replaceable would be the one keeping an independent record of everything they tried to hide. Blair finally understood that her cruelty toward Everett had not simply cost her a contract. It had become the exact instrument Nolan needed to complete his plan. She called Everett again, and for the first time she did not ask him to come back to work. She told him only that she had launched an independent investigation and asked permission to use the comparison document he had left behind as evidence. Everett agreed to share the underlying data, though he still made no promise about returning to the company itself. During the emergency board session, Nolan argued that Blair had single-handedly destroyed the largest deal in company history through erratic and unstable behavior, and he proposed suspending her authority immediately while opening formal talks to sell the company outright. Blair did not deny sending Everett away that night. Instead, she took full public responsibility for the decision and explained that the very mistake she made had led her to uncover something far more dangerous hiding inside her own leadership team. She displayed the edit history behind the altered appendix on the boardroom screen, and Nolan immediately claimed the document could easily have been fabricated by a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge. Warren called for an immediate vote to suspend Blair before another word could be said in her defense. At that exact moment, Russell Dean appeared on a video call requested in advance by Blair's legal team, and he confirmed that Langford Global's own servers had independently preserved every version of the edit, and that Nolan's digital signature attached to the change was entirely authentic and beyond dispute. The evidence proved conclusively that Nolan had altered the contract, though it did not yet prove the deeper motive behind the acquisition scheme. The board agreed to delay the vote by 24 hours to allow the investigation to run its course. Afterward, Nolan cornered Blair in the hallway and told her she was about to lose both her company and her reputation because she had chosen to trust a man everyone else in that ballroom had dismissed on sight. Blair told him her only real mistake had been thinking exactly the way he did for far too long. Not long after, Marissa discovered that the company's primary servers were being wiped remotely, and the only account still capable of restoring the lost data belonged to a recovery system Everett himself had quietly designed years earlier. Blair called Everett the moment she learned the servers were being erased, and this time she gave no orders and made no promises about his position within the company. She told him simply that Nolan was destroying evidence in real time, and that hundreds of innocent employees could be implicated if the company could not prove what had actually happened. Everett arrived at the Whitmore Dynamics building within the hour, and the same security guards who had once been prepared to walk him out of the ballroom now opened the door for him in complete silence. He made his intentions clear from the moment he stepped inside. He had come back to protect the evidence and the people it could exonerate, not to restore Blair's position or repair her reputation. Within minutes, he discovered that Nolan was using a maintenance protocol, disguised as routine system upkeep, to erase the very records that would prove his involvement. Everett had originally built an offline backup system precisely for a scenario like this one, but Nolan had quietly disabled it 3 months earlier, unaware that Everett had grown suspicious enough to maintain a separate audit log stored on an isolated server no one else knew existed. Restoring the missing data required executive-level access that only Blair could grant, and signing off on that access meant she would bear full legal responsibility if anything went wrong during the recovery. Warren called her directly and ordered her to stop Everett immediately and leave the building, warning that the board would pursue legal action against her for overstepping her authority. Blair signed the authorization anyway, right in front of Everett, without a hint of hesitation. It was the first time in this entire ordeal that she had placed her trust in him without first demanding that he prove himself all over again. Working through the night alongside Marissa, Everett recovered the deleted email chain, the access logs, and the record of payments connecting Nolan directly to Redmont Capital. Buried within that same data, they discovered that Warren had known about the scheme from its very beginning and stood to receive a seat on a restructured board once the company was sold off. While they worked, Blair tried once more to apologize, and Everett told her that an apology only meant something once she understood what had actually hurt him. It was never the sentence spoken at the ballroom itself, he explained, but the fact that she had only ever truly seen him the moment she needed something from him. Blair admitted quietly that she had built a company where status mattered more than competence, and that she had mistaken coldness for strength for far too long. Everett did not offer forgiveness in that moment. He told her that any real change would have to be proven after the crisis had passed, once there was no longer a contract on the line forcing her to behave with any decency at all. By early morning, they had assembled enough evidence to confront the board directly, but Langford Global announced they were now preparing to sign with a competing firm by noon that same day, leaving Blair with barely 6 hours to act. Everett explained that Patricia would never accept a private apology as sufficient. She needed proof that Whitmore Dynamics had genuinely restructured how it governed itself. To have any chance of reclaiming the contract, Blair would have to publicly suspend her own authority over the deal, hand final negotiating power to an independent committee led by Everett, announce a formal investigation into both Nolan and Warren, protect every employee who came forward with evidence, and accept that Langford might still choose the competing firm regardless of anything she did. Blair understood that these steps could cost her the position of chief executive. Even if the contract itself was ultimately saved, she agreed to every condition without hesitation. In front of the entire company, Blair called an emergency meeting and opened not by condemning Nolan but by accepting responsibility for her own conduct first. She repeated word for word the sentence she had spoken to Everett at the ceremony, refusing to soften it or explain it away in front of the staff gathered around her. She admitted openly that she had judged a man by his clothing and his position on an organizational chart, and that she had allowed others to steal credit for his work and the work of many employees like him for far too long. She announced that she was stepping back from any authority over the Langford negotiation and handing that responsibility entirely to Everett. Several employees who had laughed quietly when Everett was escorted out that night now found themselves unable to meet his eyes as he walked into the room. Everett took the floor without turning the moment into an act of revenge against anyone present. He told the gathered staff that the real failure was never a single cruel sentence from one executive. It was a culture that had taught everyone in that building to assume the person with the fanciest title was always the one who was right. He outlined a restructured contract built around shared accountability and full transparency of data, a system where no single director could quietly alter a clause without leaving a permanent visible trail. The entire meeting was streamed live to Langford Global at Patricia's specific request. She agreed to grant Whitmore one final meeting, though she insisted that only Everett and one outside counsel would be permitted at the table, with Blair excluded entirely from the room where the deal would actually be decided. Blair accepted the condition without protest. Nolan attempted to flee the building, carrying a hard drive loaded with sensitive data, but Marissa and building security stopped him before he reached the parking garage, and financial investigators already on their way arrived shortly. After, Warren tried to deny any involvement, but the recovered records showed he had personally approved a secret payment tied directly to the scheme. Before Everett left to meet with Patricia, Blair offered him the pen she had once intended to use for the original signing, telling him that the person who truly deserved to hold it had never been her. Everett declined to take it, telling her that if this contract was ever signed, it needed to represent a company that had genuinely changed, not a sentimental gesture born out of guilt. At Langford Global's headquarters, he found that Patricia had placed the competing firm's contract right beside Whitmore's file on the same table, waiting to see which one would survive the conversation. Patricia gave Everett 30 minutes to explain why Langford Global should still consider Whitmore Dynamics at all. He neither begged for the deal nor hid the severity of the crisis unfolding behind him. He admitted openly that the company had a serious governance failure, and only after laying that failure bare did he present his redesigned framework for the contract itself. Rather than pushing every risk onto one party the way the altered appendix once had, his new model divided responsibility, according to where a failure actually originated, with an independent audit trail attached to every transaction so no director could quietly rewrite an appendix ever again. He even reduced Whitmore's fees during the first year to help fund a stronger protection system for the client. Russell recognized quickly that Everett was not trying to rescue the old compromise deal. He was building an entirely safer contract for both companies involved. Everett walked Patricia through the safeguards line by line, explaining how any future amendment to a liability clause would require sign-off from 3 separate, unrelated departments before it could take effect, closing the exact loophole Nolan had exploited to alter the appendix in the first place. He proposed quarterly reviews conducted by an outside auditor, with no financial stake in either company, and he offered Langford Global the right to suspend the agreement immediately, without penalty, if any future irregularity was discovered. Patricia listened without interrupting, occasionally exchanging a glance with Russell, as the framework grew more detailed than anything either of them had seen from Whitmore Dynamics before. By the time Everett finished, the conversation in the room had shifted noticeably, no longer a negotiation over whether Langford should walk away, but a discussion of exactly how quickly the new agreement could be finalized. Patricia asked whether Everett was prepared to accept a long-term leadership role inside Whitmore Dynamics, and he told her honestly that he had not yet decided and that he would not attach his name permanently to any company until its internal culture had genuinely changed. When Patricia asked whether Blair deserved a second chance, Everett answered that Blair had done what was necessary during the crisis itself, but that her true character would only be proven in the months that followed, long after the immediate danger had passed. That answer earned more of Patricia's trust than any amount of flattery could have. While the negotiation continued, Blair faced her own reckoning back at Whitmore, where Warren pushed the board to fire her before investigators could formally arrive. Blair presented every piece of evidence the team had gathered and asked for nothing in return, telling the board that if they believed she was no longer capable of leading the company, she would step aside willingly, but only after they reviewed the case against Warren and Nolan in full. Several board members who had stayed silent for months finally spoke up, voting to suspend Warren and forward the entire file to the appropriate authorities. Nolan was escorted from the building shortly afterward under an active warrant covering securities, fraud, data sabotage, and conspiracy to manipulate the company's value. At Langford Global, Patricia made her decision. She agreed to sign the new $480 million contract on the condition that Everett retain independent audit authority for the entire length of the agreement. Everett accepted a role as an independent advisor, explicitly refusing to work as an employee under Blair's direct authority. Patricia signed first, and Everett signed beneath her, not as a subordinate analyst this time, but as the chief architect of the agreement itself. The contract had returned to Whitmore Dynamics, though it no longer resembled the fragile, dangerous version that had vanished weeks earlier. When Everett returned to the Whitmore offices that evening, hundreds of employees stood waiting in the lobby to greet him, while Blair remained quietly at the back of the crowd, instead of standing on any stage. The staff applauded the moment Everett walked through the doors, though the attention made him visibly uncomfortable, aware that many people in that room had only changed their opinion of him after learning his hidden history. He asked everyone to return to their work, telling them plainly that respect should never depend on how much money a person had just saved the company. Blair met him privately in her office afterward, a room that had once been filled with symbols of status and now held little more than investigation files and an unsigned letter of resignation. She did not open the conversation by asking about the contract. She asked whether he was truly all right. Only after that did she apologize again, this time without offering him any money or title in exchange for his forgiveness. She admitted that she had once looked down on him because of an old suit, a low position, and the quiet life of a single father who had walked away from a high-powered career, and that she had allowed ambition to become her only measure of a person's worth. Because Everett never boasted about his accomplishments, she had simply assumed he had none worth mentioning. She told him she did not expect forgiveness, and that regardless of whether the board allowed her to remain as chief executive, she intended to follow through on every reform she had promised. Everett told her he believed this apology carried more weight than the last one, precisely because she wasn't trying to use it to gain anything from him. He still was not ready, however, to return to working directly under her authority, and Blair accepted that answer without pushing back. The board ultimately voted to keep Blair in her role, but only under 12 months of close oversight, requiring her to report regularly to an independent ethics committee and stripping her of any unilateral power over audit decisions. In the months that followed, she pushed through a wave of genuine reforms, publicly crediting every contributor on every major project, building a complaint system that bypassed direct managers entirely, eliminating the private dining area once reserved only for executives, tying compensation to actual responsibility, rather than title, establishing a fund to support employees caring for family members, and requiring senior leadership to spend real time working alongside frontline staff. Marissa was appointed to lead internal transparency efforts, and she openly admitted in front of her colleagues that she had stayed silent about injustice inside the company for far too long. Everett continued serving as an independent advisor on the Langford account, and over the following months, he found himself meeting with Blair regularly during audit reviews. The relationship between them shifted slowly without any dramatic turning point to mark it. Blair stopped issuing orders to Everett, and instead began asking for his opinion, listening carefully, and accepting it without argument whenever he disagreed with her. Employees who had once avoided eye contact with senior leadership started raising their hands during company meetings, proposing changes to processes they had quietly resented for years, but never felt safe enough to mention aloud. Marissa's transparency initiative uncovered 2 additional instances of credit being stolen from junior staff, and both times, Blair handled the correction publicly, rather than quietly insisting that the employees involved be named in front of the entire company, rather than compensated privately, and asked to stay silent. Turnover on the customer support and engineering teams, which had quietly crept upward for 2 years running, began to fall for the first time since Blair had taken over as chief executive. Everett in turn began to notice that Blair's transformation was not just a performance staged for the public. She kept pushing her reforms forward, even when no cameras were present and no contract hung in the balance. 6 months after the night of the ceremony, Blair invited him for coffee, making it clear beforehand that this invitation had nothing to do with work. Everett asked, with the faintest trace of a smile, whether she planned to have him removed from the cafe if his jacket wasn't nice enough. Blair answered quietly that she had earned every bit of that joke, and Everett agreed to go with her anyway. 1 year later, Whitmore Dynamics held a celebration to mark the results of its restored partnership with Langford Global. The new system had been successfully deployed across 32 countries, and while revenue had grown substantially, the company's greatest achievement was something quieter, Not a single liability dispute had arisen anywhere platform operated. Patricia returned to Chicago that week to sign a renewal of the agreement. And this time, the ceremony was not staged inside a luxury hotel ballroom. Blair chose the company's own main lobby, instead open to every employee who wanted to attend, and a large screen behind the stage displayed the names of hundreds of engineers, legal staff, support workers, and auditors who had contributed to the project's success. Everett now held the title of chairman of the Strategy and Ethics Committee, a position independent of the chief executive's authority granted to him not because Blair had offered it as a favor, but because the newly reformed board had given him real power to protect the culture of the company going forward. When Blair introduced him to the gathered staff, she did not tell the story, as though she had simply discovered a hidden genius everyone else had overlooked. She said plainly that Everett had always possessed the ability everyone now admired. She had simply lacked the judgment for far too long to see it standing right in front of her. She repeated the sentence she had spoken to him at that first ceremony word for word, letting the silence that followed settle over the room before she spoke again. The only person who had embarrassed the company that night, she said, had been her. Everett stepped forward, and rather than compounding her humiliation, he told the room that an organization should never be judged by whether its leaders make mistakes, since every leader eventually will, but by how they respond once the truth forces them to look honestly at themselves. Patricia signed the renewed agreement, now valued at $720 million, and when she offered the pen to Blair to sign beside her, Blair passed it instead to Everett. This time he accepted it. After the ceremony ended, the two of them walked together past the small corner desk, where Everett had once quietly worked for 2 years unnoticed by nearly everyone who passed it every single day. The desk still stood in its old spot, though it had since become part of a leadership training space built to remind new hires of exactly what had happened there. A plaque mounted nearby carried a simple message: talent does not become smaller because someone important fails to recognize it. Blair asked Everett whether he had ever considered leaving the company for good after that first terrible night. He told her that in a sense he had left that very evening, and that the man who eventually returned was no longer someone who needed her approval to know his own worth. When Blair asked who that returning man actually was, Everett answered that he had come back to see whether a chief executive possessed the courage to change after losing the thing that mattered most to her. Blair assumed at first that he meant the contract itself. Everett told her gently that the contract had never been the thing that mattered most. What she had nearly lost, he explained, was her ability to become the kind of leader other people could actually trust. She told him she used to believe that leadership meant never appearing uncertain in front of anyone, that softness of any kind would be read as weakness by a board that measured her worth in quarterly numbers alone. Watching him work through the crisis without ever raising his voice or demanding recognition had taught her something she had never learned in any boardroom: that steadiness was not the same thing as weakness, and that the loudest person in the room was rarely the one worth trusting most. Blair admitted quietly that she had also come close to losing him before she had ever truly taken the time to know who he was. Everett invited her to dinner after the ceremony, not as chief executive and advisor this time, but simply as two people who had finally learned how to see one another without a title standing in the way. Blair accepted. Before they left the building that evening, they walked past the same front doors where Everett had once been asked to leave in front of a room full of strangers. The same security guard who had stood watch that night opened the door for them without a word. Blair paused for a moment on the threshold and told Everett that this time she would be walking out beside him. They stepped together into the city outside, while behind them, the electronic display in the Whitmore lobby still glowed with the details of the contract that had once disappeared into nothing, now standing as a quiet symbol of a company that had been rebuilt, this time on respect rather than fear. A person can be hidden behind a modest title, a worn jacket, or a quiet, ordinary life, but their true worth never actually disappears, simply because someone with power fails to notice it. Blair did not win back that contract by convincing Everett to forget the humiliation she had caused him. She won back trust by dismantling the very system that had allowed that humiliation to happen in the first place. Everett did not triumph because the world eventually discovered he had once been powerful or celebrated. He triumphed because in the very moment he was most disrespected, he chose integrity over revenge and let that choice speak for him instead. The company that emerged from that single humiliating night was not rebuilt because one brilliant man returned to save it, but because the people running it finally learned to measure worth by something steadier than a title, a suit, or a seat at the head of the table.